Yes, then it's 10 a.m. and good morning to everybody. It's very good to see all of you. And then we are ready for our first paper today, this morning. And I'm very happy to introduce Elettra Carbone. Elettra works in Norwegian studies at UCL, University College London. She has done research on the cultural relations between the UK and Scandinavia from the early 19th century, and also on representations of Italy in Nordic literature, 19th century Norwegian literature, and also, which I think is really fascinating, the cultural mobility of Thorvaldsen's sculptures through print culture. I want to mention particularly her book, Nordic Italy's Representations of Italy in Nordic Literature from the 1830s to the 1910s. And it was published in 2016. And this is also a topic Elettra will talk about today. Elettra, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Ulrike, and thank you very much to the organizers for the invitation. So thank you very much for the invitation. And as Ulrike said, today I will actually be talking about the research that I have done for the book and for a series of other articles. I was hoping to be able to sort of develop a new case studies, but I think that will be for the publication. So for the past 10 years, I've been working, among other things, as Ulrike said, on representations of Italy in literary works written by Danish, Finnish, Norwegian, and Swedish authors throughout the 19th century and during the first decade of the 20th century. This research has led to a number of articles and studies, but also to my first monograph that, as Ulrike said, was published in 2016. And today I will try not only to give you a sense of the foundation and structure of my research and of the book, but also to outline some of the conclusions that I have reached. So first, let me start by defining the research area that I've been working on, and by saying a few words about what other scholars have written previously on literary representations of Italy in Nordic literatures. So the corpus of critical literature which deals with Italy in Nordic literature is very wide, but as I'll try to illustrate, also very fragmentary. Of absolute vital importance for my study have been three bibliographies published between the 1940s and the 1950s. These are Klebergs Italien i svensk litteratur, Öxnevads Italia i norsk litteratur, and Valinkovsky's Italia Suomen kirjallisuudessa, so Italy in Finnish literature. And incidentally, note that there is no bibliography as such about Italy in Danish literature, which I think in itself is quite interesting. So these more or less comprehensive bibliographies list numerous and varied primary texts on Italy, ranging from letters, travelogues, separate poems, poetic travelogues, dramas, short stories, and novels. The biggest chunk of literature, of critical literature on the subject, is made up of monographs about the relationship between Italy and few eminent authors, such as Henrik Ibsen, Hans Christian Andersen, and Selma Lagerlöf. Critical material is also available on the connection between Nordic travelers and specific Italian locations, Rome being by far the most explored, and on the representations of Italy in one of the Nordic literatures. One of the first things that becomes evident when looking at material about Italy in Nordic literature is that this subject has remained dependent on the tradition of the journey. Most scholars focused in fact previously on travel literature, analyzing this in connection with the tradition of Nordic artists traveling to Italy. As English and German travelers before them, since the beginning of the 19th century, members of the Danish and Swedish aristocracy set on a grand tour, a journey to Italy for pleasure as well as for education. In Italy, they could come into direct contact, especially with beautiful and exotic nature, but also with classical culture and Renaissance art. From the 1830s, Italy and especially Rome and the Nordic countries were linked by cultural societies and institutions that encouraged Nordic artists to travel to Italy. Interestingly, the Scandinavian Society for Artists and Scientists, which was founded already in 1860, might have changed its name today, but still exists with pretty much the same function that it already had in the 19th century. So a little bit more about now the sort of theoretical framework of my research. So my research is an investigation of what we call literary representations of the Italy made in the Nordic countries. To adopt what I call the made in or made by approach simply means to put the accent on the process that allows any author to move from what is represented to the representation. This representative process is constructed by individual as well as collective elements. Even though each representation is unique and individual and thus needs to be contextualized, it also is constructed from elements provided by what we might call a collective conceptual map. And this map is shaped by collective traditions, such as the tradition of the Grand Tour and travel, and the circulation of previous representations of Italy, and the importance of classical education. And just to show you, I really think that this painting by family, this Norwegian painting, really sort of represents what I'm trying to do with my research. The artist trying to represent, and we seeing the artist representing the representation. The process of representing Italy is one that involves representation of space. And I have looked at various different types of theory of space representation, but one that I think I found particularly helpful for my own studies is that elaborated by Henri Lefebvre in The Production of Space. The production of space is the process that has a set of stages. And particularly relevant for my analysis is really the tension between what he calls the representations of space, which refer to all the elements that put together physically outline a specific spatial dimension, and the representational spaces, namely the symbolic meanings attached to the specific space. In order to emphasize the complexity of the literary representations that I had chosen, I decided to adopt a comparative approach, trying to understand texts in relation to other texts. In most cases, Norwegian, Swedish, Finnish, and Danish texts are compared in my studies 2 by 2, emphasizing similarities and differences. But the main criterion behind the structure of my research is that of literary genre. Genres, I think, should not be seen as a set of unnecessary boxes that only constrain any text which is placed in them, but as a flexible set of constitutive rules that apply to some literary texts, to some individual writers, usually to more than one literary period, and more than one language and culture. And here I'm quoting Fischerlov. When it comes to representations of Italy in Nordic literatures, each literary genre seems in fact to have followed a different development. Simply going through the bibliographies that I mentioned earlier, I immediately observed some interesting patterns concerning the number of texts per genre and their dating. What is striking is the impressive number of lyrical texts in the bibliography, about 400 entries comprising collections and loose poems. The more limited number of dramatic texts, around 60 in all, and then an even more limited number of novels, not more than 20 entries in total. In addition, looking at the publication dates, it is then possible to observe that the spread of these literary genres is often quite uneven. Lyrical representations appear to be constantly popular from the beginning of the 19th century to the early 20th century. Dramas mainly date back from the mid-19th century, and novels from the 1870s onwards. These patterns clearly mirror the status of a particular genre at the time when the representations were created. In addition, certain genres seem to have remained attached to specific themes and cultural trends that I will briefly outline in this presentation. So after careful consideration, I decided to emphasize these genre patterns, and so they were previously completely overlooked. And today I will focus on poetry, drama, and novel, which emerged as the most interesting cases, and are the ones that I looked at in my book, but I've also looked at short stories in separate studies. So the first chapter of the book deals with poetry, and more precisely with the genre of the poetic travelogue. Here I examine the Italian journey represented in 6 Nordic travelers. Together with the poetic persona, the reader embarks on a journey of discovery across the Italian peninsula. According to the conventions of the genre, the literary journeys are in the form of collection of poems which together should form an itinerary. Each poem is a stage of this journey and is usually accompanied by the name of a specific location and the date. Moreover, these travelogues are often characterized by all the features typical of the so-called Italio-Romantiken, namely idyllic landscape representations combined with the praise of the country's classical past. But do representations of Italy progressively lose their paradise-like connotations in the course of the 19th century? Do individual poems still represent the stage of a well-defined itinerary? So these are the questions I tried to tackle. Italian Romantiken did play a significant role throughout the 19th century. Representations of Italy as a mythical Arcadia, an earthly paradise, left too deep a mark in the imagination of Nordic travelers to be erased from the collective imagery of this southern country. Elements that are related to these topos are always present, even though to a different extent, in all the poetic travelogues that I have analyzed. Not one of these 6 collections fails to mention either the warming sun, the eternal spring, the shiny oranges washed by the dew, or even the ruins of Italy's classical past, harmonically blending into its idyllic nature. Although paradise-like features are certainly an important part of these representations, it is necessary to look beyond them. Elements of a romanticized Italy need to be considered in relation to the text, as well as in relation to the context within which they are placed. These elements are in fact not isolated. They are embedded within a number of other features, adapted, updated, deconstructed. Carl Snoilsky, for instance, renews the way in which Italy was represented, including in his poetic diary, new sounds and rhythms, unusual Italian destinations, and colorful representations of the Italian folk life. Just to give you an example here from his collection, if you read this little example aloud, you will hear the rhythm of the tarantella. Landsmenn, nå stunden inne, jord og himmel stå I brann. Upp till villa, frihetsdansen, upp med stål och bryta brann. Länge nok har främlingsligen spelat herrar I vårt hem, Massanellos tarantella då vi spelar upp för dem. You can hear that, that's what he's doing there. Skepticism towards the representation of Italy as a mythical paradise is not only a late 19th century phenomenon. Already in the 1840s, Signeusis Lys och Skugga makes his reader aware of the fact that representations of Italy are an earthly paradise is constructed by poets. So having set aside his poetic journey across Italy, becomes an occasion to stress the importance of general values, such as that of loyalty and love for his own country, Finland. In search of new paradigms to represent Italy and the Italian journey, in his poetic travelogue, Sophus Clausen tries to combine side by side idyllic elements with gloomier tones and images of the past with those of modernity. Moreover, throughout the 19th century, the conventions of the poetic travelogue are followed less and less. While the geographical and temporary itinerary outlined in Fra Italien, for instance, is a perfectly plausible one, the one in the Avlerie follows completely different criteria, which have to do more with associations and meanings than with time and space. So let's move on to drama then. So while the theme of the journey to Italy created a solid connection with poetry, mainly through the long-standing tradition of the poetic travelogue, the focus in dramatic text is not on the Nordic traveler, but on Italy and the Italians. Italian and Italianate plays and operas had become a staple of the repertoire at the Royal Theatre in Copenhagen. Italy managed to infiltrate the Danish dramatic scene through a series of different channels and traditions. The first one was that of the Commedia dell'arte. Commedia dell'arte troupes reached the Nordic countries, Denmark and Sweden in particular, at the end of the 17th century, and brought with them their set of stock plots and characters. Linked to this tradition is the Italianate or Italian-like drama, which developed in other European countries, particularly in France, and which became popular at the royal theatres in the mid-18th century. From the end of the 17th century, Italian opera also appeared in Denmark and Sweden. Since his arrival in Copenhagen in 1829, the Danish choreographer August Bournonville added another dimension to the dramatic representation of Italy, introducing lively folk life scenes through his Italian ballets. The relationship between Italy and the Nordic dramatic tradition was made even stronger by the presence in the Nordic countries of Italian actors, choreographers, and theatre directors. Italy and Italians were thus very much a part of the Nordic dramatic tradition. On the whole, the first half of the 19th century was characterized by a general admiration towards Italian opera and dramatic pieces about Italy, an admiration that later in the century was sometimes made fun of. As we can see from the little pictures that were published in the Danish satiric newspapers Korsaren in 1842 and accompanied by the observation, "The Italians have just left us. We can now enjoy the Danish Italians." The cartoons clearly joke about the fact that dramatic representations of Italians by Danes seems to lack pathos completely. But they also emphasize that even when by mid-19th century Italian actors, choreographers, and stage directors had mostly left Denmark, the Italian dramatic tradition continued to live on. On the whole, Nordic dramas featuring Italy and Italians are extremely eclectic and rely heavily on a series of other sources and traditions. I here only need to mention the tragedy Signora Luna by Carl Jonas Love Almqvist, a historical pastiche set in Sicily with tyrants, Arab courses, saint-like figures, which is clearly inspired by the operas. Another interesting example is that of Faustina Strozzi by Jonas Lie, written in 1875, which combines idyllic Italian sceneries with an interest in contemporary historical and gender issues, an interest which is clearly in accordance with the principles of the modern breakthrough. The play also seems to draw a parallel between the Italian and the Norwegian political situation. And then Canzio by Alexis Kivi shows a clear relation between the representation of Italy as a chaotic and degenerating country in the need of a strong political guide and Finland's political and cultural circumstances. On the whole, the idea of Italy as a mythical and fairy-like country seems to be progressively fading away in the course of the 19th century. In line with the late 19th century disillusionment towards the old Italian myth and with a renewed interest in the working of the human mind and behavior, Renaissance by Holger Drachmann begins to represent Italy and Italians as an ordinary country populated by ordinary people capable of irrational and impulsive acts. The final part of my research focuses on novels. 6 novels are examined and compared after having determined whose point of view the narrator is narrating from. The difference is simple but of considerable importance. When the focalizer is an Italian, Italy is represented as a home country, while when the focalizer is a Finnish, Danish, Swedish, or Norwegian traveler, Italy only remains a foreign country. But in which sense is Italy constructed differently according to whether the focalizer is an Italian character, like for instance in Hans Christian Andersen's Improvisatore, a half Italian and half foreign character, as in Bernard von Heilenstamm's Hans Alienus, or a foreign character altogether, as in Sigrid Unds's Jenny. In novels from the perspective of the Italian, Italy is represented through the eyes of an insider. Thanks to Antonio, the main character in Hans Christian Andersen's Improvisatoren, and his wanderings across the Italian peninsula, the reader explores Italy through the eyes of an expert and proficient observer. Antonio is an Italian artist and clearly has a deeper insight in the life and culture of his own country. Similarly, Lagerlöf's Antichrist Mirakler offers detailed representations of Sicilian folk life, narrated through the expert eyes of a Sicilian. Interestingly, it is only in these 2 novels with Italian focalization that contemporary elements of social criticism are introduced. The Italian focalizers are the only ones who can comment or act on to resolve social issues in their own country. In these 2 novels, social problems, poverty, progress, and change are part of the setting just as much as fantastic landscapes and folklore. The longing for the beauty of Italy becomes the central theme when Italy is seen through the eyes of a foreigner. For the foreign characters, Italy stands for the solution of their problems. It is the place where all their dreams and desires can be fulfilled. Although the aim of the foreign's journey to Italy might be the same for all the characters encountered in the novels I analyzed, namely that of finding a different or better life compared to that of the North, the outcome appears to be very different. While in some cases Italy does work its magic and really triggers the start of better life for the foreign travelers, in other cases the journey is less successful. Confused by his Italo-Swedish identity, for instance, Hans Dalienus has to acknowledge that the Italy he lives in is not the classical Italy he wished for. His mission fails miserably. The world of beauty and pleasure that he looks for is to be found neither in Italy nor anywhere else in this world. So to sum up and conclude, the way Italy is represented should be generally seen in connection with the literary movements and cultural trends in the 19th century and early 20th century. There is no doubt that some of the most recurrent literary stereotypes about Italy, among which those of Italy as a mythical Arcadia, originated during the Romantic Age. However, the issue of how to renew the way in which Italy was represented was already topical at the beginning of the 19th century. Authors were challenged by the feeling that everything there was to say and write about Italy had already been said and written. So for this reason, some writers tried to introduce a greater degree of realism, engaging with contemporary events such as the Italian Risorgimento and gender issues. This progressively leads to the attempt to convey the image of a modern Italy, but also to the end of the idea of an idealized Italy. The division of my research according to broad genre distinctions has led to a series of conclusions that cast light on the relevance of genre theory applied to literary representations of Italy. Specific genre patterns emerged concerning not only the number of texts per genre and their dating, but also the forms and themes. Most importantly, novels narrated from the perspective of Italian characters and dramatic texts are not as directly linked to the travel tradition as lyrical texts and novels narrated from the point of view of foreign characters. Another relevant conclusion concerns the relationship between Italians and foreigners. In most texts, Nordic characters recognize their status as foreigners while in Italy and prefer to observe the Italians while remaining attached to their own communities and avoiding actually direct contact with local people. But when the interaction between Italian and foreigners does take place, this is often followed by extreme consequences, either for the individual involved or for the entire communities. My study have studied to reconstruct at least some of the Italys made in the Nordic countries and the mechanism employed to create them. The gap in this field is by no means closed. There are certainly many more Italys to rediscover in Nordic literature. This is really just a fraction of the primary material at hand, some of which definitely deserves more attention. But as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elettra. This was very inspiring to listen to and a lot of relevant information in our context. And I just, when I listened to you, I just thought of our discussion we had yesterday about the hybridity of travel narratives and travel material. And you showed so beautifully today the significance of the different genres. So I think this is something, you know, we have to keep both in mind, the genre, but also that these can be hybrid as well.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So thank you very much. Are there any questions? Yes, we already have one by Solène.
Yes, it's a very interesting one. So it's about whether they had actually traveled themselves in Italy and where they sort of were getting the information from. This is one of the things I found most fascinating, because I think when I started my research, a lot of the research that was already there was mostly actually focusing only on people who had traveled to Italy. But I got very fascinated by those who never went to Italy and started writing text after text about Italy. And one example of that is the Finnish author that I worked with, Alexis Kivi, who was also one of the sort of fathers of national literature in Finland. And he goes and writes his first play, completely set in Italy, in some kind of sort of Florence-like place. He never traveled to Italy. And as I said, as a sort of the father of Finnish literature, you might find it quite odd that he decides to set one of his first plays in Italy. But obviously, I think a lot of this, and this is where I'm very interested, a lot of this comes from other literatures. Obviously, I mean, Nordic literature was then in dialogue with previous literature written on Italy from Britain and from Germany. These were the great, Goethe and Byron and Shakespeare, for that matter. They remain very much sort of the founders of representations of Italy in literature and sort of working with literary images somehow connected to Italy. So I think a lot of the inspiration for many authors, and especially for the ones that didn't travel, never traveled, and decided to write about Italy, comes from these classical authors. So also, especially, I mean, talking about the tradition of the poetic travelogue, for instance, Byron is the starting of that with Childe Harold Pilgrimage. He sort of starts off this tradition of the poetic travelogue about Italy, and so there's references to Byron keep popping up in Nordic poetic travelogues, for instance. So there's the element of sort of already a very established literary field, literary sort of baggage, or literally bibliography about Italy from other literatures as well. And then obviously, as we move along across the 19th century, there's more and more information. I mean, today we have the internet. At those times, that there were sort of books with images. I found, I think, in the National Library in Oslo, actually, one of these wonderful albums with images of what's absolutely everything that is typical about Italy, based on sort of souvenir types, images. And this is what I was thinking about this, Ulrike, yesterday when you were talking about sort of the souvenir, the function of the souvenir in feeding this interest in a country that had already such great connections with the Nordic countries.
Thank you. And we got another question by Thomas.
I mean, I can say just a follow-up question. I mean, the question is, I mean, you told very nicely that it is, so, I mean, you didn't have to travel to Italy to write on it, but is there really a major difference? I have the feeling that the experience of the place, it doesn't, I mean, the writing is not depending on the place, but on the addressee, on the public that you're writing to, the interests of the reader.
Absolutely. It's dependent on the public, and it's partially dependent also on the author himself or herself. So one of the most classic examples is Ibsen. He spent a huge amount of his life in Italy, and all he produced in terms of literary texts that are that are set in Italy is Catilina, which is deeply rooted in a sort of historical background, so sort of classical theme. He wrote that before he went to Italy. He then revised it after being in Italy, and he doesn't revise it majorly. It's not as if he sort of suddenly adds lots of information about Rome in his play. So I think absolutely, you're absolutely right in the sense that, it doesn't necessarily make a huge difference, but for some authors it does. I mean, one of the opposite examples I like to quote in relation to Ibsen is Hans Ernst Schinck, who is, not, especially abroad, he's not very well known, but as a Norwegian author, he's really dedicated a lot of his life to Italy. And that it makes some difference in some of his works, maybe not so much in the sort of literary works, which he writes dramas that are sort of loosely based on Boccaccio's Decameron, on other sort of classical literary topics, but then he also writes about the political situation in Italy, and there you can really see that he knows and he has read, he's learned Italian. That's the other thing you can spot sometimes, is whether or not the author actually has any sense of the Italian language and has had any kind of connection with Italians while being in Italy. And Schinck is completely fluent in Italian while Ibsen, who's been there for a long time, he spends all his time in the Circolo Scandinavo, in the sort of society, and staying with other foreigners, rather than he never really learned Italian. And I think that's another thing that also, so it's partially, as you say, the travel doesn't necessarily matter, but it depends very much on to what extent the author actually engages with the community if he or she travels.
I mean, if I just can follow up here, I mean, I think this is very interesting, and this is something that I was thinking about yesterday after Janneke's talk as well. The question of, what is where is the anchorage of the text? And I mean, we have a tendency to read travelogues because we're interested in the other country, the region that we visit, and so on and so on. But actually, I mean, Ulrike was talking about that as well. The anchorage is not. I mean, you don't communicate with the people that you are visiting, but you're communicating with your public at home, and so this is the anchorage, and this is the most important part. I mean, and so when you're translating, I mean, it's fascinating. I mean, in Janneke's talk, you're translating a text about Norway. What is the interest about reading a French woman's talk about Norway? Yeah? But in the same way, in this Italian things, but I think one difference between the people that went to Italy and those that didn't is that they can. I mean, the question of authenticity, authenticity, not in the sense of it is really the real Italy, but it's more like I can show you, I can tell you this is true because I have been there. I've not been outside my hotel room, and I've never met any Italian, but I have been there, I've seen it.
Been there, done that attitude.
Yeah. I mean, this is. I mean, it's just to be outside, and I read another. Yeah, but that's. Yeah. But I think it's very. What I just wanted to say, I think it's very interesting to look at this side of the communication.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. Yeah, I absolutely. I think that this was really what drew me to the topic. Partially is really, I started looking. There's another one. Lots of Finnish examples of people who write about Italy and have never been there. Interestingly, but yes, yeah.
Well, thank you, Jakob. If you have a very brief question, then we have time. Otherwise, we go on to our next paper. Go ahead.
I'm not sure if it is. Well, I'll do my best. Thank you, Elettra. That was fascinating. You make a very interesting reference to Henri Lefebvre, the production of space. How would you link his use of production to your use of not representation, but the verbal equivalent to represent? It seems to me that if you link the two, then perhaps the temporal dimension of space becomes accentuated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Just briefly, I think that this is why I quite like the concept of this is a British scholar who talks about this made in or made by approach. I quite like to use that together with the concept of representation, because I think it makes really the idea of actually producing, of shaping, of creating something. And I think it's an essential point. But also, as you say, made by and made in, it needs to be made by in a specific time. And so the element of time and the sort of production of temporal dimension, as well as that of a spatial one, are sort of interlinked. I don't know if that answers the question, but sort of, yeah, absolutely, I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you again, Elettra.
Thank you all for the invitation.
And then we go on to our next speaker, and Jannike, please.
Thank you, Ulrike. Okay, so our next speaker is Anders Johansen. I will be very brief in my introduction, but he works at the Department of Information Science and Media Studies at the University of Bergen. And he has published on a wide field of subjects on political rhetorics, public sphere, academic writing, and museology, to name but a few. And I would just like to draw your attention to his very latest book, Komme til orde, Politisk kommunikasjon 1814-1913, which was published last year. And we're very happy to have you here, Anders, and we're looking forward to hearing more about Nansen as an ethnographer. Thank you.
Thank you. In the great age of adventurous exploration, say between 1870 and 1920, knowledge of the exotic other was fit into a figure of development in which race and cultural form corresponded step by step. Foreign cultures were treated as expressions of inferior biological properties. In all established cultural research of this time, this perspective contributed to making a caricature out of any observation on human diversity and to the derailment of all attempts at realist explanation. However, from this period, one may also find examples of cultural studies that seem rather advanced, even today, using forms of documentation and analysis that in many ways live up to modern standards. But these are the works of natural scientists. Ethnography proper was practiced at the writing desk. Museum work was largely based on objects and information collected by tradesmen and missionaries. If ever professional ethnographers moved into the field, they were travelers, staying a few days at each place, collecting objects for the museum, measuring the skulls, describing the houses, inquiring about the customs, and moving on. In a situation like this, when every encounter is very brief, preconceived ideas may be very easily confirmed. However, a geographic or an oceanographic expedition could be stuck in the ice for months, even years. Its original business might have had to be put aside for a while. Knowledge and understanding of the natives on whom one had become dependent in that situation might have come as an unexpected bonus. Out of this kind of encounter, centered on relations that were practically useful and based on reciprocal obligations, cultural understandings of a new kind could develop. To be sure, established ethnographic discourse was never seriously challenged, but an expedition gone astray was a kind of practical and social situation in which that discourse, without much comment, could be put aside. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, the most important means of obtaining knowledge of the exotic foreigners was a voyage of exploration. Its documentary form was the museum collection. Its literary form was the travelogue. As the blank spots on the map were unknown territory in many respects, exploration was a task for many disciplines. Cultural research was normally part of a more comprehensive project, including various kinds of natural history research. Anyhow, it was a matter of producing and procuring objects for the scientific collections. Exploring a part of the globe meant bringing home observations of many kinds, but above all, it meant bringing home objects. Plants for the herbarium, birds for stuffing, skulls and potsherds from the archaeological excavations, spears and masks from the ethnographic investigations. The museum was the central institution of knowledge of that period. What an object could represent in the way of cultural knowledge was not decided in the field by observations of its use. It was established in the museum through descriptions of its form. The curators would compare objects from many places and organize them according to material differences and similarities. In that way, they could identify not only the general stages of development, but also the areas of diffusion and the paths of spreading out from a point of origin. Grouping the objects so as to establish a series of modifications of some technical or aesthetic detail, the museum curator could discover connections between the various peoples in the remote past, then finally being able to elucidate the central question of their origin and their descent. As a form of documentation, the collection prepared for both evolutionist and diffusionist interpretations. That kind of interpretation was, in a very practical sense, based in the museum institution and the collection itself. However, the written form of the documentation was the history of a journey. The Knowledge obtained was organized as a narrative by the movement itself from place to place and from day to day. The various subjects were not separated out and treated in any systematic way in specialized chapters. Rather, they were presented bit by bit and chronologically in between descriptions of the landscape and reports on the difficulties of traveling. Typically, the account of the expedition was a combination of enlightenment and entertainment. In the travelogue, there was no decisive line of division between professional science and public information, or between knowledge and personal experience, or even between academic and artistic ways of writing. Knowledge of the exotic foreigners was presented as an exciting and often dramatic narrative of the travels of the explorer as collector. When, for some reason, this practice of knowledge came to a stop, the exotic other might present himself in a new guise. The voyage of exploration was then transformed into a long, concentrated stay in the field. Sometimes the travelogue was replaced by a monograph concentrated on its ethnographic subject, with separate chapters on technology, marriage and family life, religion, etc. Instead of speculations on developments and origins, the writer returned to reflections on the practical functions of objects and customs. Sometimes the conversation became more important than the collection. Tempering, if not entirely removing, racial contempt, a new kind of recognition and respect seems to have instilled a sense of relativity in the interpretation of and the evaluation of customs and belief, far ahead of its time. According to 19th century development paradigm, there is a correspondence between the distances of space and time. Going far away, one will sooner or later arrive in a place that belongs to the remote past. Hence, the study of the remote stranger was normally motivated as a study of one's own prehistory. The civilized centers of the world being contemporary and modern, the societies of the peripheries were treated as bygone in a sense. Thus, the exotic strangers were excluded from that kind of common present in which reciprocity in the form of dialogue or cooperation is possible. They could be treated as objects of knowledge, comparable to the finds of the archaeologist or the sources of the historian, but they could not be treated as fellow men that one could actually listen to and try to understand. This was the point of view of the old museum ethnography. Savages living in the wilderness at the end of the known world seemed to belong to the Stone Age or even some earlier stages of development. However, in relation to the expedition of the polar explorers, these beforeigners, if I can put it that way, they often played the roles of hosts and partners, even teachers in the art of surviving, and that, of course, was liable to undermine the illusion of time travel. A friend with whom one stays for weeks and months, hunting together, eating together, is fully contemporary. He cannot easily be kept at a distance by excluding him from the common present of conversation and interaction. In 1888, an expedition led by Fridtjof Nansen traveled across Greenland, its purpose being to discover the unknown interior of the island, shedding light on conditions elsewhere in Europe during the Ice Age. Arriving its destination at the western coast too late to reach the last sailing that autumn, the expedition had to spend the winter in Greenland. Nansen, who was a scientist specialized in zoology and oceanography, took the opportunity to study the way of life of the local Inuit population. Staying with the Danish inspector, he also visited the Inuit, often weeks at a time, participating in their daily life and work. I live their life, I eat their food, he writes in Eskimo Life. I talk with them, at least I try. I work with them, paddle in kayak with them, hunting, fishing, skiing with them, and it more and more dawns on me that it's not really impossible for a European like me to become an Eskimo if only I had the time. However, half a year is not enough. Really getting to know these strangers, learning to see all things with their eyes would take several years of hard work. However, his own modest contribution is more than enough to break through the wall of ordinary prejudice. Superficial consideration may easily lead to the conclusion that the Inuit belong to a low stage of development, remarks, but if one takes the trouble to take a closer look, observing them while participating in their own activities, then this conviction will soon have to be revised. The point is not to characterize them from the outside, like an impassive observer, but to understand them from the inside, grasping their own point of view. What can be achieved by this kind of study is the correction of the propensity of Europeans to look down on these children of nature as an inferior race, end of quote. Even challenging them to liberate themselves from the ingrained contempt for all so-called natives. That's a quote from Nansen. In Nansen's version, the Inuit way of life was an advanced adaptation to extreme natural conditions. He examined not only the technology and the use of natural resources, but also the household and family life, and presented it all as an integrated system. Demonstrating the practical rationality of traditional arrangements, he argued for the value of Inuit knowledge and for the limitation of his own. As a polar explorer interested in learning from his more experienced hosts, he even treated them with a certain admiration. Outsiders who wanted to make improvements of any kind, introducing wooden houses or guns or Christianity or whatever, would inevitably bring disarray into this ingeniously balanced order, seriously impairing or even destroying it. Of course, Nansen is not devoid of attitudes that will today be treated or read as offensive. The Inuit are often treated as children, for instance, living in the present in their own happy-go-lucky way. This doesn't mean they are inferior to us. In fact, Nansen often insists on the contrary. Quoting the Bible's injunction to live like the birds in the sky, he interprets their supposed lack of worry and care as a higher form of wisdom. Though the report on his encounter with the Inuit was exceptional at the time, it was not without preconceptions, of course. Defending these children of nature is also a way of attacking modern civilization. So-called progress brings with it overly refined habits, producing a generation that is nervous and effeminate, according to Nansen. To an adventurer like him, modern man is typically a kind of machine with a degenerate body and an enslaved mind. Thus, progress is also in many respects a process of decay. And the Inuit, who can now be recognized as the noble savage himself, is the true measure of that decay. Though occasionally a contemporary in everyday life and work, he is also a survivor from a remote golden age. His simplicity and his innocence are proofs, as it were, that he belongs to a time before the fall and the expulsion. Later in life, Nansen on several occasions showed his contempt for so-called inferior races. After his travels in Siberia, he described the Samoyed and other indigenous peoples as morally degenerate. In the United States, he insisted on observing more or less the same problem, seriously worrying about how to prevent mixing of the white and black populations. This change in attitude is due partly, I think, to a development of his concept of evolution from a Lamarckian to a harsher Darwinist position. Partly also it's due to his basic conviction of the nobility of primitive life in its pure original form and of the destructive effects of all kinds of contact with the superior forces of civilization. But it was also due to a change in the situation of the encounter. What was once experienced through a relation of hospitality and cooperation was now seen from the outside and in passing as a traveling observer. While scientists like Nansen were sometimes grappling with questions of meaning and function in local context, thus anticipating modern social anthropology, ethnography proper was preoccupied with the distribution of separate cultural features as evidence of migrations in prehistoric times. Ørjan Olsen was an explorer of the old school. When in 1914 he organized an expedition to the Fjågesund in southern Siberia, it was to find the roots of the Samic people nowadays living in Norway, northern Norway. The scientific objective of the expedition was to collect botanical and zoological material that could shed light on the advent of natural species from the east, and in exactly the same way, quote, to collect ethnographic, archaeological and anthropometric evidence pertaining to the question of the origin of the Lapps and their immigration to our country. What is documented in the report of that expedition is the travel itself, across the endless steppes, through the virgin forest, up the river in canoes and on rafts, while birds are prepared for stuffing, graves are opened, temples are robbed, bears are shot, until finally succeeding in making contact with a group of natives. Without listening to anything they might have had tried to say, they could be studied like everything else as specimens of a natural order, by collecting their material belongings and by photography and physical measurements. The theory of the original identity of the two peoples was supported by the comparison of disparate cultural traits. Reindeer herding and skiing occurred both here and there, and holy mountains and holy birds, and porridge made out of milk and wild angelica, and a swaying gait and a nasty ingratitude. In this search for origins, there was no trace of the sense of relativity that was already apparent in the work of Nansen. After a visit that lasted only a week, the expedition was able to conclude that the Fjågesund belonged to the lowest possible stage of culture. They were superficial, irresponsible, quarrelsome, boozy, dirty, lazy, unreliable, and thievish, and absurdly exacting. In the modern world, there was no justification for a primitivity like that. When the last shaman drum is finally silenced, Olsen concludes, and the old population has been replaced by the expanding white race, a rich and flourishing future will be opening up in the land of the Fjågesund. To be able to break out of that way of seeing things, what was needed was apparently ignorance above all, or at least a certain lack of academic training. During the winter of 1919 to 1920, Roald Amundsen's ship on its way to charting the Northeast Passage was stuck in the ice north of Fjågesund in Siberia. Harald Sverdrup, the expedition's expert on meteorology and oceanography, decided to seize the opportunity to join the nomadic Chukchi people in order to learn their language and their customs and usages, as he put it. Having absolutely no training in the humanities or the social sciences, he was able to produce a study of remarkable quality. What I myself have seen and heard I may account for, he stressed, but as a pure amateur in this field, I'm not in a position to make reflections on the origins of the various customs or to offer impressive comparisons with conditions in other places and among other peoples. What he himself saw as a limitation, we may now in retrospect see as a strength. Sverdrup's method was that what is nowadays called participant observation. He lived with the Chukchi, learned their language, listened to their conversations to find out what it was like to be a Chukchi, what that the world looked like from their point of view. Not being able to locate them on a certain stage of development or within a wider culture group or area, he was all the better apt to catch the specifics of their local forms of life. For the same reason, he did not reduce his informants to anonymous representatives of a homogeneous culture. In his version, they were also individuals with a name and a distinct personality. In the report on this long fieldwork, they appear as fellow men on their own behalf and on an equal footing. Nowhere is this approach demonstrated as in a more striking way, perhaps, than in the treatment of gender and sexuality. More than 100 years ago, Sverdrup was able to write about homosexuality or the exchange of sexual partners as something to be understood, as far as possible that is, and with great difficulty, but not condemned. In a moving passage, this amateur ethnographer is portraying a remarkable middle-aged woman with a good look and a beautiful dress and with a deep voice and a dark stubble on her chin. a highly respected sorcerer, it turns out to be. This person, who in every respect behaves like a woman and who is apparently also recognized as a woman, turns out to have been a boy and a man who at the age of 25 declared that he had decided to change his life. Visiting her in her own tent, Sverdrup is struggling with a certain uneasiness that seems to bother no one else, but he doesn't respond to that feeling with accusations of savage depravity. In an encounter like this, treating the other as a contemporary, sharing the present moment with her, any lack of understanding is a personal challenge to be taken seriously. If Sverdrup is not comfortable with the ambiguity of this human presence, it is not because of some defect in the other, but because of his own shortcomings as an observer. Now, to accentuate the radicality of natural scientists like Nansen and especially Sverdrup, I will now conclude this talk with a striking example of the limitations of the old museum ethnography. In 1913, Christian Leden started a journey that was going to take 3 years alone with his dog sled across the tundra to pursue his ethnomusicological studies among the Inuit populations living to the west and northwest of Hudson Bay in Canada. To win the confidence of his informants, he wrote, he knew from previous experience that he had to do it alone in situations resembling anthropological fieldwork in a modern sense. As a pioneer of both film and phonographic documentation, his literary style is obviously influenced by these new media. His travel diary is a montage of concrete and detailed bits of observation in the form of close-ups of everyday life among his Inuit hosts. However, this rich observational material was of no academic use to him. Professionally, he was a collector. On behalf of scientific museums in Norway and Canada, he made recordings of folk songs, the scientific study of which would then take place after returning home as a formal analysis of this material, independent of anything experienced in the field. The musicological work had nothing to do with his fascinating travel diary. To make sense of his recordings, he had to undertake a drastic biological reduction. According to the evolutionist theories of his time, the study of the musical expressions of so-called primitive peoples was a method of discovering the origin of music at the very dawn of time. According to current diffusionist premises, musical forms were indications of basic racial characteristics, revealing past relations between contemporary populations. Correlating then certain distinctive features of their music with the shape of their skulls, for instance, Leden was able to establish the basic unity of the Inuit and Indian populations, falsifying the older theory of Mongolian descent. Certain differences in the musical styles of the native populations of eastern Greenland and Canada were explained by the occurrence in the first case of blood group A, which is common in Western Europe, but extremely rare in native North America. Thus, the sounds brought home by Leden by his wax-coated cylinders were forced to make sense, namely as scientific evidence of race mixing due to contact with Norse settlers more than 1,000 years ago. Seldom have I seen the poverty of the old theory of time travel demonstrated as tragically as in this case, when it seems to block all possibilities of sensible interpretation in a rich and dearly bought field experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Anders. It was very interesting, and I also think that kind of fits into nicely to the preceding discussion of the significance of the traveler actually being there, and in this case also for how long. Makes a difference. So we're a bit over schedule, but we have time for questions. This is from Solen. I'm just going to read it out loud.
Yeah.
If the Inuits are described as children, as you said, does it place Nansen in the position of a father towards them? And if yes, is it more compassionate or a severe one?
Well, I don't think he takes up a patriarchal position like that. He's also a pupil learning from them, how to build a kayak, how to make use of a harpoon, how to survive, how to produce a costume that he can use in that cold weather. So his there is a certain condescendence, but he takes no responsibility for them except arguing against Danish colonization and missionary activities, and asks the Danish to get out of the island. But no, I can't see he takes any patriarchal position apart from that.
Thank you. Ulrike, you have a question?
Yes, thank you very much, Andrés. This was really fascinating. I just wonder about the role of the field itself, so the role of the Arctic. And I think particularly of the 19th century, when the Arctic was seen as a cleansing space and where Western man could reinvent himself and rediscover himself in the context of civilization. And to what extent does this play a role that Inuit were actually living in the Arctic and actually were able to deal with this space? While others, maybe Siberia was not considered as the kind of real Arctic because of, you know, the lack of the snow ice and all these kind of ideas which were so current in the 19th century.
Well, I think that in Nansen, especially, it's very clear, and also in the work of, say, Eivind, I forgot his name. There are other Norwegian explorers too who hail the Arctic populations as survivor of, you know, an original paradise, and before the process of civilized degeneration. So they are not only honest and simple and reliable in every way, but also they have physical properties that should be admired, of course. Going there is also a kind of proving one's own masculinity in a heroic struggle against the dangers and the hardships of the ice and so forth. So it of course has a certain extreme moral value, both to join them and to learn from them. Yeah.
Thank you.
Eivind Astrup is the name. Then he writes a book about the neighbors of the North Pole. He participated in the 2 expeditions of Peary in the 1890s, writing about the Inuit populations in Greenland as a kind of original Christianity or primitive communism to be an ideal for everyone. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, I have 2 on my list before we continue with the next speaker. The first one is from Silje Gaupset about I'm just going to read what you wrote, Silje. I think I missed this detail. However, were you referring to Sverdrup's Nytt Land?
No. I refer to, this is Harald Ulrik Sverdrup. He was, and he published his report as a part of Amundson's big volume on the Maud expedition to the north of Siberia. And also later on, I think he published a separate volume called The Tundra People or something like that in the 1930s.
Thank you. And then the final question from Jakob.
Thank you very much for your wonderful talk and for contributing to the conference and to the book. I didn't know, I knew vaguely or a little about Nansen because I've read På ski over Grønland, but I did not know about Harald Ulrik Sverdrup, nor about Christian Leden. So it's extremely interesting. I have one very brief comment and one question. The comment is, I'm not sure, it's not not necessary, but there is a certain similarity perhaps also with Helge Ingstad's description of the Canadic Inuits in Pelsjegerliv, which is of course later, but also would fit into your point about an extended period of time. But just one possibility. The question is this: do you think that Nansen, in addition to this extended time, which seems to be absolutely crucial, would also aided in his, or influenced in his attitude to the Greenlandic Inuit by his scientific, his attitude and his work as a scientist, as in the natural science, not least in the natural sciences. That is, his quality, his patience, his scrupulousness as a scientific observer.
Yes, probably, definitely. But I'll rather concentrate on the first part of the question about Ingstad, because the knowledge regime that I'm talking about, it fell apart. It belonged to a certain period of globalization and communication possibilities. After the advent of the radio and the airplane and the satellites, this kind of expedition lost all academic interest. It became a kind of athletic feat, continued by people like Thorset or Mansen, or in the northern Norwegian, what I call polar tradition, which is not really heroic anymore, because everyone can come to your rescue at any time, and you never lose contact with the outside world, and it's what you discover is of no interest to anyone anymore. You're not there to discover anything. It's purely sportive. I think Ingstad is a transition figure in that process. He's trying to keep alive an older tradition which produces bestsellers and fame, while writing without any substantial scientific or academic intent. There are several others who try to seduce the general public with while pretending to have such a important academic question, like Thor Heyerdahl, for instance, is an example of that. And also when Ingstad is going to find the lost tribe of the Apache, for instance, to find Geronimo and his descendants, to which he never finds, and he has no real but serious scientific purpose, but he pretends to have one. This will be very valuable from a cultural point of view, etc. But the hardships of the travel, it takes over all the intention then. And that during the 1930s, 40s, 50s, you have these degenerate forms of the genre before it finally disappears completely.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you again very much, Andrés, for your beautiful talk. And we're going on to our next speaker. And I'm very happy to introduce Peter Fjågesund. Peter is a Scholar of British Literature at the University of Southern Norway. And his research interests are in British literature and culture, Anglo-Scandinavian relations, travel literature, polar history. And Peter has also translated several books, among them Robinson Crusoe. Peter has also written several books, and I just would like to mention two, and which actually most of my master students have read, and that with great interest and pleasure. And the one is The Dream of the North, A Cultural History to 1920, and another one with Ruth Symes is The Northern Utopia, British Perceptions of Norway in the 19th Century. And today, Peter is going to talk, as you can see here, about Nordic stereotypes, a critical examination of the traveler's gaze. The screen is yours, Peter.
Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to move straight on to my paper. A lot has been written in general terms on the travelogue as a genre and on the perspective, or the so-called gaze, of the travel writer. In this paper, my original plan was to cover three main areas. First, I wanted to discuss some general characteristics of the travelogue genre that I found of relevance to the primary texts under discussion. Secondly, I intended to discuss a selection of representative 19th century travelogues from Norway. And thirdly, to compare these with three modern travelogues. But with only 20 minutes, I will be concentrating on the third and final point, that is the modern travelogues, and hopefully leave the rest to the article format. So I will be looking primarily at the ways in which I feel Norway and the Nordic countries are being subjected to stereotyped descriptions in the following three travel accounts. Bill Bryson's Neither Here Nor There from 1991, Joanna Kavanagh's The Ice Museum from 2005, Michael Booth's The Almost Nearly Perfect People from 2014. Now, the choice of texts has not been based on very careful and scientific criteria for the following reasons. Whereas the 19th century witnessed an enormous number of travelogues from the Nordic countries, the number these days is extremely limited. Strictly speaking, the three works in question also represent rather different examples of the travelogue genre. Bryson's is clearly the closest to the traditional form, whereas Kavanagh's book combines, as the subtitle indicates, the genre with an investigation into the specific question of Thule or Ultima Thule. And Booth's book is also to a large extent a reflection on the Nordic countries based on observations by a professional journalist who has lived in Denmark for several years and who is married to a Dane. Bill Bryson's Neither Here Nor There contains one chapter from Norway, and it describes more specifically a bus trip from Oslo to Hammerfest in Finnmark. For Bryson, an American living in Britain, Norway in itself is very clearly peripheral, and Hammerfest is, quote, a remote and forbidding place situated on the edge of the world, unquote. Thus, the mental map of the author has been made perfectly clear. Bryson then follows a relatively stereotyped recipe, which involves a number of well-known ingredients. First, as a first-person narrator, he adopts a humorous, somewhat clumsy and clown-like persona. This quote is from the beginning. Things had not started well. I had overslept at the hotel, missing breakfast, and had to leap into my clothes. I couldn't find a cab and had to drag my ludicrously overweight bag 8 blocks through slush to the central bus station. Bryson then acquires our sympathy by facing a series of obstacles or difficulties, a technique equally common in travelogues and in reality TV, and by handling them with corresponding clumsiness. The primary function of this strategy is not just to entertain the reader, it also creates a space in which he can speak freely and somehow off the cuff while having secured our sympathy. The narrative then moves quickly from an almost slapstick-like humor to what amounts to disparaging the natives and their way of life. I don't have time for examples here, but the picture of Norway Bryson outlines for his readers, almost from page 1, is a dual stereotype. One that consists of a combination of the primitive, in terms of nature as well as civilization, and the over-bureaucratized. That is, on the one hand, the stereotype of the 19th century, and on the other, the stereotype of modern Scandinavian social democracy, or as many Americans would call it, socialism. There is something almost Soviet-like about Bryson's portrayal of his Norwegian experience. The next bus does not go until next week. When he gets on the bus, it is hopelessly uncomfortable. And when, American style, he wants to talk to the manager to complain, he is told that the manager is in Stavanger. The journey north is characterized by a catalogue of complaints about prices, cold weather, an empty landscape, and taciturn people. Having reached Hammerfest, which he calls a "thank you God for not making me live here" kind of town, and having found a hotel, he is awakened in the night by a storm. The storm opens up a new stereotyped feature, the dramatization of Norwegian nature and Norwegian scenery. The wind was unrelenting. It drove before it tiny particles of ice that seared my cheeks and made me gasp. And twice the wind all but picked me up and carried me forward several yards. Only the toe tips of my boots maintained contact with the ground. I discovered that by holding out my arms, I could sail along on the flats of my feet, propelled entirely by the wind. I had a great time until an unexpected burst whipped my feet from under me. I cracked my head on the ice so hard that I suddenly recalled where I put the coal shed key the summer before. Now, this excessively exaggerated and clownish description of his encounter with wild nature, an encounter that no doubt amounts to complete fictionalization, is then used as a stepping stone for a return to reflections on Norwegian society and culture. Back in his hotel room, he attempts to watch television, which he describes in this way. There is only one television network in Norway, and it is stupefyingly bad. It's not just that the programs are dull, though in this respect you could win awards, but that the whole thing is so wondrously unpolished. Films finish and you get 30 seconds of scratchy white circles like you used to get when your home movies ran out and your dad didn't get to the projector fast enough. And then suddenly the lights come up and the day's host, looking faintly startled, as if he had been just about to do something he wouldn't want the nation to see. The best that can be said for Norwegian television is that it gives you the sensation of a coma without the worry and inconvenience. Now this could have been funny. It's not. If we come to the travelogue genre with the expectation that it will provide us with some kind of open-minded encounter with foreign cultures, if we believe that the travelogue may open our eyes and extend our perception, even if wrapped in a humorous form, this is not doing any of the sort. On the contrary, it cements some extremely unpleasant stereotypes, perhaps not primarily about American conceptions of Norway, but even worse, about American conceptions about themselves and the greatness of their own culture. If there is as much as a trace of an American self-irony in Bryson's humor, it is effectively overshadowed by a deeply condescending contempt for everything else in Norway than powerful scenery, which in itself contributes to a perception of Norway as a primitive country, effectively a wilderness, on a par with northern Alaska. But that is not all. I'm sure Bryson would claim that he is self-ironically playing with the fact that Americans are notoriously bad at learning other languages. But before setting out on his European tour, he proudly proclaims to his friends that he only speaks English, and he comments, "But that's the glory of foreign travel as far as I'm concerned. I don't want to know what people are talking about. I can't think of anything that excites a greater sense of childlike wonder than to be in a country where you are ignorant of almost everything. Suddenly, you are 5 years old again. You can't read anything. Your whole existence becomes a series of interesting guesses." Again, he makes a humorous virtue of his own utter ignorance and expects that his brashly American approach will appeal to the reader. As to Joanna Kavanagh's The Ice Museum, one may justifiably ask what genre it belongs to. On the jacket, the publisher presents it as blending travelogue, memoir, and literary essay, which sounds rather sophisticated. And it clearly aims to imitate such hugely successful writers as Bruce Chatwin, Barry Lopez, Robert McGee, and Robert Macfarlane. It also contains a considerable element of journalism in the form of several interviews with actual prominent people, such as the Norwegian philosopher Arne Næss and the first president of Estonia, Lennart Meri. With regard to sources, the book is mute. It contains no references, not even a bibliography. Essentially, everything in it is presented as either undisputable general knowledge or the writer's own experience. For a reader with a certain amount of academic training and knowledge, this creates a profoundly ambiguous and problematic literary space, because the book is littered with factual mistakes and inaccurate information. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to give you examples. More serious than this extremely nonchalant and misleading treatment of facts, however, is, as with Bryson, the constant play on traditional stereotypes. It begins during the author's visit to Munich to investigate the proto-fascist Thule Society from the 1920s and contains some rather silly British stereotypes about Germans with obvious allusions to the war. And when she comes to Norway, the cold, as with Bryson, is another constant stereotype in the narrative. Even inside the building of the Fram Museum in Oslo, the coldness is emphasized. And when she describes a place near Trondheim, where she spent a 5-month period a few years earlier, she claims it was impossible to walk for more than an hour in the cold air. It made my lungs ache. This hampering on stereotypes reaches parodic proportions when she reaches Karasjok in Finnmark, where she wants us to believe that she's not the only one to find the cold unbearable. She goes into a supermarket where everyone was buying hats and gloves because the wind was growing harsher and more persistent by the hour, as if the local population in Karasjok run to the shop for hats and gloves every time the cold sets in. In Karasjok, she also meets a local inhabitant, presumably a Sami, with a sword tied to his belt, who tells her about Sami history. He rattled this belt, and for a moment I thought he might draw his sword. Such details might be perceived as innocent and exotic, but they are mentioned on a number of occasions and without irony, and as such, they continue to confirm ancient stereotypes and prejudices about primitivism and violence. In other words, an absence of civilization. The same happens when Kavanagh later in the book goes with a ship to New Thule or Qaanaaq on the northwest coast of Greenland, situated more than 77 degrees north. This section is clearly inspired by Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Marlowe's Voyage to the Inner Station, to the extent of borrowing whole phrases. And again, she employs the same overused technique as Bryson, namely complications, obstacles, and drama. First, she uses ideas from Conrad in the description of the ship, which is a smashed-up icebreaker that barely stays afloat. And on board are a motley crew of odd German scientists, another stereotype from popular literature. Secondly, she supposedly overhears an argument between the captain and a Philippine sailor, again a Conradian borrowing. Because of the extreme weather, they argue as to whether it's safe to travel this far north. She also gives the impression that not even the captain knows exactly where they are. Neither of this carries any credibility whatsoever. And having finally arrived at this settlement, which in reality has about 600 inhabitants and is connected by air, Kavanagh again describes a community whose culture sounds almost prehistorical. In the evening, out in the bitter cold, she observes how the local drunks come out in strength. And an Inuit man appears with a guitar. He seemed a piece of curious defiance as he sang to the twilight. He was singing about the mountain by Old Thule, where the Inuit had buried their dead. It was a lament, soft in the stillness. As he played, the locals began to sing along, a strange chorus lifting their voices to the ice plains. It was crazy and moving, this faint sound of voices in this village in the wilderness. How credible is this? And how credible is it that the Norwegian governor, or Sysselmann at Svalbard, is an omnipotent autocrat with a fat rule book, who is the fixed subject of nearly every conversation? Half of Longyearbyen loved him like a father, and the other half cavilled violently, yet they all obeyed him. A quick check reveals that the Sysselmann in question is most likely Odd Blomdahl, who served at Svalbard from 1991 to 1995. His obituary from 2015 describes a man who got along splendidly with everyone, high as well as low. But Kavanagh has been in desperate need of dramatizing a situation that most likely contained no drama whatsoever. The result is a forced and artificial travelogue that borrows elements from creative fiction. Michael Booth's The Almost Nearly Perfect People, on the other hand, starts with an unusual and almost self-critical acknowledgement. Despite centuries of close connections, despite the apparent success of the Nordic countries, and despite the recent wave of international interest in everything Nordic, he poses the question why our knowledge of Scandinavia is still so abysmally lacking. Scandinavia, he says, is really a terra incognita. The lack of interest is deafening. And furthermore, where is the travel writing on the North? This is all rather open-minded and generous. Still, I would argue that Booth's perspective is profoundly influenced by a feature that also characterizes Bryson's and Kavanagh's accounts, namely an innate centralism, which again tends to take the form of condescension. Booth's voice is very distinctly that of a well-educated man from the city, and his gaze on the Nordic countries has as a basic premise that culture and civilization belong exclusively to the center and to the city. Booth combines this attitude with a Bryson-like use of humor. In the chapter on Denmark, for instance, he discusses the enormous but almost invisible pork industry in the country. We've heard more about the mink in the last few days. And soon after, he brings up the fondness of the Danes for clubs and associations. And he says, there are also 219 folk dancing clubs in Denmark, but don't worry, as with the pigs, you very rarely see them. As with Bryson, this could have been funny, but it runs in tandem with a persistently condescending and irreverent view of, and Rye comments on, everything that exists outside the cities. Jutland and Jutlanders are described in the following prejudiced and sexist way. Jutland is windy and smells of manure. The people remind me a little of Yorkshiremen, blunt and chippy, mistrustful of Copenhageners and their fancy ways, and perhaps a little narrow-minded. The men wear denim dungarees and ride farty little motor scooters. The women, it has to be said, are staggeringly beautiful, particularly in Aalborg for some reason, but Jutland offers little by way of cultural entertainment or natural beauty that you can't get in Zealand. This is a gaze, by the way, that is very similar to what we find in 19th century travelogues on farmers, the Sami, and people of color, in short, people from the social and geographical periphery. Booth persistently finds these rural parts of Denmark sad and boring, and seems to have no worries about the prospect that in 2050, only 10% of the Danish population are expected to live in the countryside. This is further reinforced by the fact that, like Kavanagh, he interviews various experts whose function is to provide inside information about the country. But all of these are urban experts working in the capital and expressing an equally centralized urban perspective. They are, in short, perfectly compatible with the author himself. One of them, Arne Knudsen, a newspaper editor and anthropologist, claims that the origin of the so-called Jantelaw is to be found in traditional peasant societies, and having offered a rather damning analysis of how envy and a demand for uniformity have shaped modern social democracy, she adds, but you know, the envy part is not the important part. The important part is the inclusiveness. We want to include you, but that is only possible if you are equal. It's what peasants do. In a similar vein, Booth is almost aggressively negative to such Scandinavian phenomena as hygge and the adjective folkelig, both of which are intimately associated with the overall informality and equality of the culture of Nordic countries. He cannot stand hygge's tyrannical, relentless drive towards middle ground consensus, its insistence on the avoidance of any potentially controversial topics of conversation, its need to keep things light and breezy, the whole comfortable, self-congratulatory, petit bourgeois smugness of it all. And when discussing the term folkelig, he first claims that in a kind of reverse Midas effect, it turns everything it touches to cack, whereupon he reverts to the same technique as Bill Bryson, that of adopting a disarming self-irony. He openly admits he loathes everything that is folkelig, but lots of people like it, and I acknowledge that I'm a hateful snob. And this is not the only time he uses this strategy. A few pages earlier, when expressing another of his dislikes of Danish culture, he says that, I realize I sound like a reactionary old fart when I say this. And a few pages later, he calls himself a cynical misanthrope. Now, for many readers, these may serve as successful rhetorical tricks, that by admitting that he sounds like a reactionary old fart, he makes sure he actually does not sound like one. But it may also be read as sounding precisely like a reactionary old fart who adopts an attitude of cultural superiority while making every effort to dodge any accusation to that effect. A similar attitude seems to be visible behind another sweeping statement about the Danish folkeskoler, which he describes as so comedically poor that he and his Danish wife have been forced to send their children to private schools. Now, as a conclusion, despite the fact that these three modern travelogues cannot be regarded as representative, they do, with all their differences, contain a striking set of similarities in terms of underlying and sometimes cunningly camouflaged stereotypes, which seem to confirm that Anglo-American prejudices and preconceptions about the Nordic countries are still alive and well, even among supposedly modern, liberal, and open-minded observers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. It was really interesting also to the way you showed how stereotypes shape perception, but also how the stereotypes you expect your readers to like and to be interested in shape the travel narrative. So that was really fascinating also for us, since we have heard so much about 19th century travel narratives. It's really interesting also to have a comparison with contemporary travel narratives and see that sometimes not so much has changed. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yes, I have one by Alexandre. Alexandre, if you would like to ask it yourself.
I can see it. Whether they were publishing successes. Well, I think everything that Bill Bryson touches is a publishing success, isn't it? So I think that's pretty obvious. The last one, I'm not sure. I don't know. But the second one, the Kavanagh's book, must have been a pretty major success. It's been marketed heavily. There are several editions of it. There have been something I didn't have the time to talk about, amazingly positive responses to it by loads of people. And in what I hope to become an article, I'm going to include some of these, because that is another part of it which I find really quite unpalatable, to be honest. I mean, this praise, this unreserved praise, even by people who must have extremely little knowledge about the book, and they sort of describe it as an amazing and sort of profound insight into these regions that she's traveling in. So I wrote a review of this book when it came out, a very critical one actually, and it was referred to on standing still, the great bookseller, the internet, Amazon, where you can actually print these or post these things, and it was taken off very quickly. It was removed very quickly. So that says something about what the marketing system wants to see and what they don't want to see.
That was very interesting to hear now, Peter. Yeah. And we have another question, and Elisabetta.
Yeah, hello. So I'm very interested in stereotypes, and I was just thinking, but can it be that stereotypes are an important part of a travelogue? So it is a part of this genre. So if you buy a book that is defined like a travelogue, so you are expecting to find these stereotypes, and if you are an author, so this is a kind of a rule So you are writing about another country and you have to use these stereotypes. And another thing was about this, can it be that it is a national style of Americans, so or English-speaking world, that they have this position, also a kind of stereotypes, a little bit ironic, a little bit comparison with the others, and so on. Yeah.
I don't know exactly what to answer to that. So they obviously don't have to use stereotypes, but it's like Thomas was mentioning earlier on, they are writing for their readers back home. That's what we always have to keep in mind. So they are, in a sense, constantly keeping in mind the kind of horizon that their readers have back home, and that it becomes, sadly, in some ways, pretty decisive for their approach in many cases. But I mean, the really interesting travel logs that I've read are precisely the ones that bring up questions and actually discuss things, where instead of just confirming the old stereotypes, obviously. That sort of goes without saying in many ways.
Yeah, okay, so it is a rule to become a bestseller, maybe. You have to use this.
I think very much so, which is sad, because you would want these writers to write honestly and clearly and straightforwardly, rather than just living up to expectations already there.
Yeah.
Thank you. We have time for one more question. Jannike?
Thank you. This is kind of in line with Elisabetta, what you were saying. It's perhaps more of a reflection, but your paper really made me think about what is kind of the travel writing genre's role today. You know, why do we read travel writing about other people's experiences in other parts of the world, and many often countries where we could easily go ourselves? So perhaps this kind of use of stereotypes is also a way to kind of play on the identification of the reader with certain stereotypes they already have of certain countries. I don't know, but of course you also have like Chatwin and Kapuscinski, who maybe not always were necessarily truthful, but they were kind of more inquiring and less stereotyping, in my opinion, at least. But that was just amusing that you made me think about.
Yeah, I think it, for me, there is a certain responsibility for the travel writer as well, you know, in what he or she brings across. Because I think the readership back home, we all have great confidence in these reports coming in from people who have really traveled and done all the work that we haven't been able to do. So there is an element of confidence we have there, which a travel writer should be taking seriously. And this is what really provoked me with Kavanagh's book in particular, because it has such it is sort of surrounded by this halo of profound insight. The whole way the publisher has packaged the book as well gives everyone this impression that this is proper work, this is well done, and a sort of thorough job done on this material. And I read the book as a Norwegian and find all these sort of pretty basic errors and factual mistakes in addition to these stereotypes. And that worries me, to be honest.
Thank you. Thomas said he has a small remark, and please, Thomas, go ahead.
Just a very, very small remark. We always have the tendency to speak bad about stereotypes, and I think, of course, it is a reason. But I mean, the problem with this, with these travelogues, is not that they use stereotypes, because I mean, could we live without stereotypes or without frames of knowledge, or of what I would call myths of knowledge or something like that? The question is how we use them. And I mean, this is what your point was, but I think it's important not to say, is there a possibility to write a travelogue without stereotypes? I think this idea of Elisabetta is interesting to say. we have always to work with these stereotypes that are in one horizon of expectation of the readership. But how to do it, how to manage it, and this is the big question.
Yeah, I suppose it's to do with the degree of awareness that we are actually all stuffed with stereotypes.
Yeah, and I mean it's the meaning of it. I mean, I don't want to know every detail of the travel of my reader, my traveler, of like what you said. But I mean the general ideas, the general experiences, that what has been typical. And if I say typical, I'm telling about stereotypes. So, but the question is, I mean, do I then say to my reader, this is like the way you have to imagine Norway, and there's no other way to imagine Norway than that? I mean, this is the question. I mean,
yeah. Well, thank you very much, everybody. I can see that we have yet another question, but maybe we can answer it in a break, or who wants to stay here a little bit longer. But,
okay, we're nearing the end of the conference, but we have one grand finale for you. Last but not least, Tyrone Martinsson. I've seen you on the screen these last couple of days, but I haven't properly introduced myself. It's nice to see you and welcome. Now, Martinsson is a scholar at the Photography and Literary Composition Unit at the University of Gothenburg, and he is working on the history of photography and the photography of today in relation to environmental and landscape photography, with emphasis on how photographic images can be used in human/environmental relationships, and also how our view on nature and landscape changes over time. And he has done both artistic work, but also scientific research. And of the many things he's done, I would just like to mention a recent article, which is relevant to this conference in particular, The Arctic Region's Visual Stories from a Changing North from 2019. So please, Tyrone, we are very happy to have you here, and we're looking forward to hearing more about the works on the very fascinating Andrée expedition.
Yeah, thanks a lot for inviting me, and it's a fascinating forum, and it's been really interesting to sit and listen into all the talks. I mean, I'm primarily somebody who comes from a practice-based background, and so I'm a visual practitioner, but also a sort of practice-based photo historian. And I will not really talk about what you introduced today, as I was asked to talk about another part of my life in a way, and that is the Andrée expedition. The reason for this is that I almost 20 years ago now, I wrote my dissertation, got my PhD in England on the Andrée expedition, and it was on the photographer of that expedition. And I will just very, very briefly tell you about the expedition as part of this talk. And at that time, I got to know the filmmaker Jan Troell as well. So from this, I was asked to talk about something that had to do with the film that has been made about the expedition. And that film is based on a book, a novel by Per-Olof Sundman. So I will try to just take you through that sort of story more. It's not going to be about the expedition. It's going to be about the mediation of the expedition and the narration of the expedition. And if anybody don't know too much about the expedition, I will give you a very brief introduction, and then you can Google it, or there are several books if you think it sounds interesting. So anyway, this is the start. This is it was an expedition that happened in the year basically 1896, 1897. And what we see here is a photograph taken 11th of July, 1897. That's when the balloon is taking off. This was, it was really something that was very popular in its time. People followed it, and there was a lot of tourists coming up to their base camp at the northern part of Svalbard. They had gone there in the summer of 1896. At that time, there were three men. It was the initiator of the expedition, Solomon August Andrée. He was an engineer and a very special man in many ways, a real character. And then there was a meteorologist, very famous in his time, called Niels Ekholm, and the young photographer, which has been my focus always on this story. They didn't succeed in 1896. They went to this place, they found their place where they wanted to build their base camp, and they prepared everything, but they were too late in the season and the winds didn't suit their purpose. So they had to abort the whole thing, go back to Sweden, wait another year, come back the next summer, and then they succeeded. They took off, and this is what we see here. What then happened is, of course, the whole story of this expedition. It plays out in the Arctic. There's a lot of more sort of to this story, but the sort of central, the core thing is basically what is happening in Svalbard, both the summer 1896 and the summer 1897. When they took off in 1897, the meteorologist had left. He jumped the expedition. The reason for jumping the expedition was clearly he was stating this is not going to succeed. He had learned from the summer of 1896 that this whole project was doomed. And it was all going back to the fact that the balloon was leaking a lot of gas. And they couldn't fix that. So anyway, they take off and they disappear. And this is where they end up, and this is where they are later found. The island that you can see sort of barely as something in the far distance is Kvitøya. And Kvitøya is on the northeast of Svalbard. I'm standing here on an ice floe. This image was taken in 2009. And at that time, we couldn't get our Zodiacs into the island because we didn't dare to pass through the ice with a lot of tourists. I was guiding tourists at this point. So we took the tourists down on the ice floe. And it was really nice in a way because standing here is standing in a position of seeing the island as the Andrée expedition actually saw it when they came floating down on an ice floe. So Kvitøya plays a really important role in this story because in 1930, the expedition was actually found. So they disappear in 1897. They fly out, nobody knows anything about where they are headed and what happened. But in 1930, by chance, they were found. So what did they find when they came to Kvitøya? It was as I said, by chance. It was basically an expedition that was scientific and hunting who needed fresh water. They stopped outside and they sent in a couple of people to the island to get the fresh water. And they found traces of the expedition, and then the whole thing just was breaking news. So what they found was the 3 bodies of the men. They found a lot of equipment, a lot of artifacts, but most importantly for us here today, and that has also shaped the whole sort of creation of all the stories that has come out of this, was that they found not only all the journals and diaries and notes, but they also found photographs. They found exposed film that then could produce 93 photographs from the expedition. And what I found very interesting with this is that what we get and what we still have is a raw material of the whole story. This is unedited, completely unedited. And this is something that is quite rare in a lot of the history of polar exploration, that you find something that gives you something that has not been edited by any survivors or any parts of people taking part in the expedition. This is raw material. And I think this is one of the things that has kept this story alive. Also, another thing is the photographs. That's been very important. And this is one of the photographs. This is one of the sort of iconic images from the expedition where the balloon has landed on the ice, and you can see 2 of the expedition members standing and they're looking at this event or this moment that happened. In 1930, there is a very fast process that gets all the things back to Sweden, and they publish a book. This is the English version of the book, the Andrée Diaries. It comes actually out in 1931, but in 1930, there's a Swedish first version, and there's also a Norwegian version coming. The interesting thing with all the books is that they're a bit different. So actually, the Norwegian version contains some material that was not published in the Swedish one. And also this, the Andrée Diaries, is different. It's a translation, but it contains things that are different. So if you really want to go through the original sort of sources on sort of writing about the expedition, this is the first ones that are really, this is the sort of report, this official book of the expedition. It's quite good actually to look at all the different versions, because there are different information in them. So were there, I mean, also the Andrée Diaries is written with an agreement with the families not to be critical. There is a very clear agreement where the families promise that this book will be a book that gives the men credit. So it's a kind of special book in that sense, even though it has a lot of different sources and a lot of different angles and so forth. Were there any critical voices? Because of course this is in Sweden a kind of heroic, very heroic, I would say, drama. And yes, there were. And the most fiercest one, I think, was Frans G. Bengtsson, which is a very famous Swedish writer, who was really extremely critical. And he was critical against the sort of idea that this expedition was now turned into this very heroic expedition that should not be criticized in a way. So he writes this article, and he had some problems getting it published, but it's there. And it's just important to know that it was there, actually. Then there is the museum. This museum, the Andrée Museum, which is in a very small town in Sweden called Gränna, it was formed immediately, basically, when the expedition were found in 1930. The sort of beginnings of the museum was formed. And the reason, of course, is that Andrée, the leader of the expedition, grew up here. It was not until after the war, after the Second World War, that the museum actually got all the material. So they got it from Stockholm down to the museum in Gränna. And this, what you see here is an image of, this is what the museum looked like, for instance, in the 1970s when I was a kid. I spent a lot of time here in the summers. This is the same kind of museum that Sundman would have walked in. This is the same type of museum that John Troell was walking in. It looked like this for a very long time. And then there was a little bit of changes in the 1980s, then another one in the 1990s, and today it looks like this. This is the latest version of the museum. And I would like to say, just as a note, if you happen to have time and passing Gränna, it's really worth going into the museum. And even if you've seen the museum, I mean, like if you were there 5-10 years ago and haven't seen this new museum, this is something completely different. This is actually lifting this museum to an international level at the moment. I would say that, I mean, you have From Museum in Oslo, which is one of the greatest polar museums in the world. But I would say in terms of, this is a very small budget compared to From, but they are actually doing something with this museum now that makes it also expanded. This has been an idea in Gränna for a very long time to do that. Now it's becoming a little bit more of an Arctic museum in Sweden. This is the only polar museum that exists in Sweden. Anyways, the museum is also important as a source. And then Per-Olof Sundman, who is also a famous Swedish writer, he took on this story in the 1960s. And in 1967, he produces this book, Ingenjör Andrées luftfärd. I think it's called The Flight of the Eagle in English. He was an international success. He was doing, this book was really doing very well. Sundman, of course, is is using that raw material that I talked about. He goes back and he is basically not only writing a novel, even though the book to the left is a novel, the book to the right, the book to the left comes in 1967, book to the left in 1968, to the right in 68. And the book from 1968 is a non-fiction book. So he's actually working on both of these books, which I find very interesting. And I would say that the non-fiction book is also really interesting because it also is changing a lot of how the expedition had previously been described, and he's definitely changing the sort of the publications around the expedition. He is breaking new grounds, and there is sort of before Sundman and after Sundman in a way. So the novel, not to get into much detail of it, the one thing that we could just remember is that what he's doing is that he's creating the story. And of course he has a kind of idea and kind of a punch to it. And one of the things is that he creates actually a kind of idea of the expedition and also about why Andrée was pursuing this even after that most of the people around him knew that this is not going to end well. Sundman is also kind of planting that, and he's actually plotting that, and it's still with us, that's the story. I would say that Sundman is still coloring a lot of how we understand the expedition, because what he's saying is that, yes, Andrée was the leader, and in a way, Andrée painted himself into a corner. He had no other opportunity. He had no choice. He had to take off in 1897. He couldn't return to Sweden then. And of course, it's an ethical and moral dilemma that brings with it, and that is because if he knew that as the expedition leader, that things would not go well, because this is another thing that Sundman is saying. He knew very well that there were very slim chances for this to succeed. So why did he then bring two young men with him into death? And this is something that is sort of at the core of Sundman's novel. He makes another thing, for his novel, he makes another clever decision, and that is that he chooses Frenkel, because in 1897, as I said, in 1896, they had a meteorologist with them, and he jumped it. The expedition. What Andrée is doing is that he brings in another young man, another young engineer into the project, meaning then that who is left is Strindberg, Nils Strindberg, the young photographer, and also Strindberg is then in charge of the scientific work of the expedition. So what Sundman is doing is that he picks Frenkel as the narrator for the book. And I think he does that for one reason, that is that we know very little about Frenkel. So Frenkel is a perfect narrator that he can work with when he's working with a novel, that is. Because if we then go to the book to the right, Ingen frukt and intet hopp, I don't think it's available in English actually, that is something very different. Then Sundman is clearly separating his novel from his non-fiction work, and he's sort of working his way through all the previous publications and everything you can imagine about the expedition, but he's still sort of pursuing his idea that Andrée knew that this was not going to end well, and so forth. And then, of course, based on this, and I'm moving ahead a bit faster, I know that, but Jan Troell is coming in. And I think it's interesting because Jan Troell is basically doing the same thing as Sundman. Jan Troell is doing a feature film. He's filming Sundman's novel, as you see the poster to the left here on the screen. And then he makes a documentary. Documentary he makes in 1997, the centennial of the expedition. But he's sort of working on the same kind of sense of doing this It's fictional work, and he's as he says here also, it's freely based on Sundman's novel, and it really is that, because what Troell is doing is that he is really bringing in a focus on the photographs and the visual legacy of the expedition. Because Niels Strindberg, the young photographer, it was originally, the intention was to use the photographs taken from the balloon to map the region they were flying over. But of course, they landed on the ice and everything totally changed. So going from that topographic use of photography, Strindberg ended up being sort of documenting their walk across the ice and their struggle to survive. And here, of course, is just another image of the two sort of novels. One is a written and the other one is a film. And here are the two documentary works. One is a text and one is a film. But they're kind of following the same ideas. And I think Troell is sort of buying that idea that Sundman is planting of the way Andrée didn't have a choice and so forth. But as I said, there's a great difference, and this is how I met with Troell. That is the focus on photography and the images and the visual legacy of that expedition, because it is kind of unique in that we have also something that can be read as a visual diary almost. And this is, of course, what Troell is doing for the film. He's really using the photographs. And we can see that in the film. And I know that the original idea that Jakob had was that we should watch the film. And I can only say that if you have the possibility, I think it's available on, it's either HBO or Netflix, I can't remember now, but one of them has the film. It's restored, so it's now become this really beautiful version that is out. There's also a Blu-ray version out that I can highly recommend, because that includes a lot of other material, including the documentary. It's all subtitled in English, and there's interviews with John Troell and all these other things. Really actually a good buy if you still watch DVDs. So this is one of the sort of also iconic images. You can see here, this is just a grainy still from the film. But what I wanted to show was that this is a way of depicting the balloon, and of course you can sort of recognize that Troell has used the photographs that are available now. This one is from the start, of course, but then if we look at what is happening when he's making the film, I could have had a lot of examples, but I only brought one here. This is a very sort of iconic moment in terms of the photographs. This is the photograph that he's using. So he's really creating a lot of these scenes in the film that are directly based on Strindberg's photographs. But what he also does is that he actually includes photographs. So like a slideshow, you get to see photographs from the expedition in the film. There is another thing that is interesting with Jan Troell, and that's when we met first time, we talked about this, and that is that he's using the unretouched images, which is unique at this time. In terms of publications, the unretouched images are not used until 1997. Before that, everybody used the first set of images that was produced for the first books in 1930. They are all heavily retouched images. And this is one image that has become very sort of well known in the story of the Andrée expedition for several reasons. But also it gives us a little bit of a sense of Sundman is a writer, and he's not really going that much into the photographs. Jan Troell comes as a filmmaker, and he's completely basing his sort of vision of the expedition on the photographs. And then he's adding, of course, everything that comes from the written sources as well. But it is the photographs that are central. In Sundman's case, it's a lot of the writings. And we can see that, for instance, in what Sundman is doing with this image. He is, as you can read here, for you who read Scandinavian, there is I'm just going to very shortly, this is actually from the book, the text, and it says that Andrée has shot the first seal. This happens on the 15th of September, and then he talks about the men and how they look and so on. So the first seal, 15th of September. Well, he's right. It was very late in time, not until September, that they shot a seal and were able to keep it. Shooting seals are difficult. You have to shoot them so they die instantly, otherwise they'll dive and disappear. This happened late in September on the expedition. But there's something with this image, and if we look at it, the good thing is that there are two exposures of this moment. So we have this one. This is the original version of this. These images, this image that you see here was retouched in 1930. This is what it looks like in the original version. There's another image that Strindberg took on this occasion, where you can see the man in the background is Andrée, and the man in the front is Frenkel. They're standing there, and there's something laying on the ice, and Sundman interpret that as a seal. It's to the right of Frenkel in the front. But if we look just in front of Andrée, there is something else. And the thing is that these images, they are in the sequence of negatives. They are along this image. And this is an image of Andrée shooting the first polar bear on the landing site. This is in July. They're all posing in front of this bear. And again, if you go back, this is where they're standing with this. And in front of Andrée, there's something on the ice. When I was working on these images, I took away all the sort of damaged parts of the image to then reveal what is in the exposure. And if you look at what is encircled there, it is the nose of a polar bear. So what is on the ice in front of Andrée is the skin of a polar bear. So this is not a seal. This is the shot polar bear that has been flinched. And it makes sense also because this is the latest, the last image that is found. It was in the camera on Kvitøya. And this is a portrait of an ivory gull. And if we follow André's diary, we can read the description of this bird. And it's down to the absolute little feathers of the bird. And this is taken on the 22nd of August. So the thing is that we don't have any photographs after the 22nd of August. So 15th of September, we don't have any photographs. So that's another kind of lead that it cannot be a seal that is shown there. But also when we found the skin on the ice, and this is something that we talked a lot about, Jan Troell and I, because he's sort of also saying that it's been so important to him to read the photographs and to read them alongside the text and to understand what was happening on the ice. And I think, again, if we go back to that sort of idea of the raw material, I mean, we can see today, Bea Usma, for instance, who has been very successful in her, she published a book and she's still working with the expedition. She's going back to the original material. We have all the publications, we have all the people prior to us working with this. But I think the uniqueness with this expedition is that we have this kind of raw material that we can all go back to. And what Jan Troell did with his film was that he was really introducing Strindberg's photography into the story and the story making of this expedition. And as we can see here, this is a shot from the movie where they were actually filming some of the parts on site. So this is on location at Danskøya. And it's interesting, this is also from the film. And of course, what he's doing, Troell, is that, I mean, they were there also. I should say that Sundman was with Jan Troell up here when they were looking for locations in the late 1970s for the film. And Jan Troell had an 8mm camera with him. So there are some really interesting stuff that you also get on the Blu-ray if you get that little package. But this is also interesting because we've sort of addressed that, even though Sundman don't really address it and Troell is not really doing it either. That is the work that Strindberg did. So there's another story to be told, and this is the story that I've been working with. The story of Strindberg as somebody who is using photography. And in this particular case, he is actually using his camera as part of mapping the area. He is updating a very old map of this particular area in Spitsbergen. We are now using his photographs to look at the changes in the landscape. So he's part of another type of storytelling that we are using. And I want to end on another thing, and that is the ending of the story. If we look at Sundman's novel, what he does is, as I said, he's using Frenkel as the narrator, meaning also that Frenkel is the last survivor. The only thing we know about the three men on Kvitøya and how they died is that Nils Strindberg, the young photographer, was the first to die. How do we know that? Well, he was buried, and he's the only one that was buried. So we know that he died first. What happened to Andrée and Frenkel, we know really nothing about. There's been all these different ideas, but we cannot really say what happened. And this is what B. Ousma now is trying to figure out, what happened with them. Sundman is, of course, then, as he uses Frenkel as narrator, he's of course including in his novel the death of Strindberg. And I think actually Sundman's book is a good read. As a novel, it is a good read. And he's very, I think he's quite sensitive when he writes about the ending of this. And he does it very well. And he also lets Andrée die in the book, of course, because that's the way. So Frenkel is the one being left alone, and he kind of just ends like you're sitting there, you're reading the book, and suddenly it just ends. So he leaves us with whatever ideas we might have about the sort of what it would be like to be here. But on the other hand, there's something, of course, again, I think very different between the novel and the film, because in the novel you have to sort of you have to visualize what it would be like to be out here. And I think this is the more powerful thing with the film, because this place is a really, really harsh place. This is not really Kvitøya, but still it looks very, very much like Kvitøya. Kvitøya is an extremely harsh place. When you get there, you just realize that getting there was not really being saved. It was just changing environment to challenge you to survive. And the expedition, Nansen had been mentioned here earlier today, and he was really important, and he's a shadow over the whole story of Andrées' expedition, but that's another strand of this story. But he was also very important as a hope, because they knew that Johansen and Nansen had been able to survive under very, very harsh conditions out in Franz Josef Land. But this expedition was very, very different from that. And the men who came up here on the shores of Kvitøya did not have any of that experience that Nansen and Johansen had. So what happens in the film, as I said, it's freely based on Sundman, and that is that Jan Troell chooses to leave Andrée as the last man standing. And he does that, as far as I'm concerned, and it's not only because I really like Jan Troell and what he does, it's that I think it's extremely beautiful. This is one of the things I can watch this and I can get that feeling of what it might have been to actually be there alone, knowing that what I'm facing now is a winter. I'm facing the darkness of the Arctic winter with my dead companions. And what Andrée is doing, it's just Max von Sydow, and in this is the sort of last scenes in the film, is that he's standing there and he's kind of trying to see how much do I see of myself without the mirror. And this is something that Troell is slowly building up towards the end of the film, this sort of idea of who am I really? So, and what are we doing here? So I think this is something that both Sundman, but I think more Troell is also sort of taking this story and making it into something that is about us. It is about, because I think that's how I read this story of the expedition. I think the Andrée expedition is a really interesting story in terms of being read as a kind of macro sort of story of modernity, but it's also something that has so much to do with us as human beings. So I think that's how I read this story, and this is also how I want to read Jan Troell's film. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tyrone. I see that I have been a very bad timekeeper, but I was too mesmerized to pay any attention. But I think this also really, thank you for showing us all of these images and also these very interesting reflections about the factual and the fictional and how they're intertwined and kind of impacting each other in our reception of polar history. We have time for questions before I give the word to Jakob for just some concluding words. So please let me know in the chat when you're ready. Yes, Peter, please go ahead.
Yeah, just a very quick question as a follow. This reminds me, or this reminds everyone, I suppose, of Captain Scott as well. There was one image you showed where you were speculating about or not speculating about the seal versus the polar bear. That picture actually reminded me instantly of the picture of Scott's expedition at the South Pole with Amundsen's tent in the background. That sort of sense of utter loneliness and sort of being stranded, being lost, being doomed, really, the same kind of quality. So that was just a comment. And then a brief question. Why are there no diaries? Why were there no diaries found from the last period? You seem to be saying that there is no documentation, no material written by them from the period before they died. Again, a sort of similarity to Captain Scott.
Yeah, well, there are diaries, and there is something called the Andrées' second diary that was found in his pocket when they found the body. The problem with that is that it's very, very damaged. So we don't really have more than there's a couple of pages where you can read sort of just a few words on each page, and I, of course, if that diary would have been kept as the other, because he has a first diary, and that was really taken good care of and was packed in a boat that was standing by the campsite, so that was protected and had survived quite well. But the other book, and this is something that of course can be, you can speculate then that maybe Andrée was actually the last one to die, because in a sense he was found with all these things in his clothes, and if he would have died first and Franklin would have taken care of it, he might have protected his diary. But this is why we don't know too much about the end, so to say. But I think also, as your remark, Scott is a very good example of this, and I usually, of course, have Scott as somebody that it's very similar. I mean, even though I think it was 7 months after they died that they found them on the Björnborg Glacier, but they did the kind of same thing, very sort of kind of unique way of finding some an expedition that sort of left their legacy. Even though I think that Scott managed to arrange a lot more than this expedition did. And now, I mean, there are others. We're of course following the discovery of Franklin's expedition in Canada.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Yeah, sorry. Now, I was just thinking that, especially in the beginning, I was thinking that it is very similar to a story that I read in a Russian book that is called Two Captains, but it is a story of an expedition that was lost, and then they found everything, especially diaries and photos. And for me, it was almost impossible to find photos 20 years after or even more, and then to manage to see them and and now it was so you prove that it is possible. So it was not, I thought that it was just a fictional story, that it was completely impossible, but no, so it means that it was possible still, but I think that's the story is a little bit similar, maybe. Yeah, so but I read the book and
thank you, Elisabetta. Okay, then if I may, because I was just also struck by the fact when you showed this photograph of the seal being a polar bear. And this was from the documentary version, I guess, from Sundman, or by Sundman. But I was also struck by the fact that how he interprets the photograph, and Frenkel and Andrée, that he interprets Andrée as worn and old, and he interprets Frenkel as, you know, young and still with some kind of vigor. And I think that's also kind of reminds me of how the documentary work is also based on interpretation. So I don't know if you would like to comment more on that.
Yeah, I think you're right, but I mean, for me, as somebody who is very much based on using visual sources and sort of using them as equal to any text sources. I think one of the things that Sundman is doing here is that he is interpreting those photographs. He's reading them, but it's also interesting in a way because what he's doing is that he's assuming that this is the case. But I think it might have, and that sort of just this is September. So they've been on the ice for quite a while, and Andrée has changed and everything, but it isn't really that way. This is in July. So they've just landed. It's actually within a week of their landing, and they're standing there. And I think we can look at Andrée and say, yeah, he looks a little bit like that, but I'm not really sure that I agree with Sundman on that, actually. But I think this is something also that is, if you look at that book, the nonfiction book that Sundman is doing, the photographs are in the back of the book. They're not really included in the book. There's something that is attached to the book, and I think it takes quite a long while before the photographs are sort of taken into this story, whether it's academic or non-academic, where the photographs are actually taken in, and we're saying that well, the photographs are as important as sources as the text is. They're as important as the diary. They're actually a visual diary, which I think they are. You can see that clearly when they're landing and when they start to work on the ice. Strindberg has been writing a lot prior to that. After that, it seemed like he's very much concentrating on photographing. And they knew that if they survived, the photographs would be extremely important. They had seen Nansen came in from his world tour. He came to Stockholm and he was showing these photographs, and they're talking about Nansen's photographs on several occasions. And we can see that sort of at this time, photographs had become something that was, you had to have photographs. If you're really going to go out there and talk about it, you needed the photographs to be shown. So Strindberg is really working on that. And this is also sad that we don't have any photographs after the 22nd of August, because it might change. So we don't really know whether he was keeping that up, I want to show what we're doing, and because there's a lot of scenes. The one you saw with the boat that I was showing, I mean, there's a lot of scenes like that, and they are obviously staged. So in as they are walking and really fighting their way through, they stop and they organize these photographs. And I think they're done with a purpose. It's a purpose of illustrating a situation on the ice that is then going to be presented when Andrée had already started the book of the expedition before he left. So there was this sort of idea also of this is going to be a grand story when we get back.
Thank you for that. I have one final question, and that is Silje Gaupset. Silje, please.
Thank you, Tyrone. I really enjoyed your talk. And I was wondering if you could comment on the potential crossing of fictional and non-fictional borders in Bea Usma's novel, on her take on the expedition, and on her use of photographic raw materials.
Yeah, I think, I know Bea, of course, and I think that the non-fictional and the fictional work, she's working on a new book now, and also there is at least said in Sweden that her first book will be dramatized, so it will become a sort of documentary for television. But I think it's something where she's taking a very interesting approach in terms of actually it's a story about her as much as it is about the expedition. To begin with, that is. I think this is changing as she's gradually becoming a sort of expert in her field. I mean, she is a medical doctor and she's doing something that very few people have done before. She is concentrating fully on trying to figure out how they died and what happened after they were found. But I think that she is, in the first book, she seemed to, I haven't really asked her this, but she seemed to have made the choice of also telling the story. It's about herself, about her relationship with discovering this story. And also, as she also talks about in the book, falling in love with it. And as far as I know, she's still very obsessed with this story. And I think that I think the way she approached it in the first book works very well, because you are kind of following this obsession. And the interesting thing is that she's not alone. She is doing this beautiful book, and she has the capacity, I think, to do it in that way. And she's also acknowledging that she's traveling up there and she doesn't really like it because she hates to be cold and all that. But I think it's about that relationship with the expedition, where you are also deeply interested in something. And she chose a format where she was sort of writing also about herself and her own discovery in terms of what then sort of her possibilities of actually doing something new, I think, with the expedition. And it's difficult today to do anything new with the expedition because there's so much written about it and it's become so well known and the museum is doing so much work on it. But I think I haven't seen the new book, so I don't really know where that is taking us. I know that the new book is going to be more about the relationship between the young photographer Nils Strömberg and his fiancée Anna. So there's this love story again, sort of. And if the first book was a love story with the expedition itself, I think this other book is going to be about a love story within the story, and how she's going to follow them in trying to get to know more about their love story, in a sense. I don't know if that at all answered your question, but...
Thank you so much again for your wonderful talk. I now give the word to Jakob, who will just give a short conclusion of these 2 digital days. So please, Jakob.
So I would like to thank all of you for participating, for giving a series of extremely interesting papers, which are different, yet also all of them linked to and contributing to improved understanding of this fascinating genre, travel literature, travel writing. As you all know, I mean, this conference is possessed of a value of its own. And Jannicke and Ulrike and I would like to thank you all for your contributions. At the same time, or having said that, these papers also form a very strong basis for an important book, which we'll definitely try to produce with the three of us as editors. And it will hopefully, we think, have the same title, that is Nordic Travels. It will give you the opportunity to elaborate, to write a bit more. Will give you a length limit, probably approximately 6,000 words. We haven't decided specifically. What we'll do now is, assuming that all of you want to contribute to the book, we'll send you some information about formatting and so on very soon. And we would also like to ask you tentatively if a deadline of, say, the 1st of June next year seems possible or seems realistic. Do you think that early June, 1st of June 2021 could be possible? If so, we would be, very grateful to you. What we are also thinking of, I mean, planning has become so difficult now under these circumstances with the pandemic. But hopefully next autumn will look very different from now. And what we might do then is to try to arrange some kind of mini seminar, or at least gather those of us who can in Oslo, and then arrange a small seminar or just a meeting linked to the launch of the book. So what we are aiming for is to publish the book at some point next autumn, perhaps in about a year from now. That is our plan and hope. I should add that we need a little bit more funding. This is always one of these tedious yet even decisive or very important details when it comes to producing a book, but we are hopeful that we'll succeed obtaining the funding that we need. Okay, so in a few days, or at least certainly within a few weeks, we'll send you an email with details concerning formatting, length, and so on. Our publisher will hopefully be Novus Press, Novus Forlag, and they have promised to include at least some illustrations, which is, of course, important, especially to some of you. But I think this has been extremely inspiring and also a very strong, not just illustration, but actually documentation of the continuing interest and significance and range of travel literature. So I would just like to thank you again, all of you, for contributing. And hopefully next time we can meet up physically or in person, perhaps here in about a year. So take care, all of you, in this very special time, and thank you from Ulrike and Jannicke and me.